Your child is born alive and dies soon thereafter. Can you claim a dependency exemption for your child? How were they born? Alive. We talked about this too long on Tuesday night. People got it. I happened to bring up stillborn kids, and it ended up, I wanted about 6 minutes of discussion, it being almost 20. But somebody researched it during the class. We have a classroom with computers, so I didn't have to bring a laptop. And they said, and the rule said the child has to have had a heartbeat. Has to have had a heartbeat. And then you could claim them as a dependent. So watch out for these scenarios here. I think this chapter 3 is not that easy. I'm much happier when we're talking about items of gross income. But we're going to be talking about standard deduction and the kiddie tax, and we're going to be talking about filing status. It's going to get confusing. Now we're not going in. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Lana.
Yes.
Okay. Qualifying child, don't they have to have lived at least half a year with the taxpayer?
Yes, but their principal place of abode must be with the taxpayer for greater than half the tax year. But if they're away at school, like boarding school or something, that's okay. So
are you talking about the birth of a child?
Yeah.
No, they could be born on December 31st, and you can claim.
Oh, I see what you mean. No. Yes. Obviously, they only lived 1 hour, let's say, and then died. No, that's they still would qualify. In other words, that I hadn't. Thank you for clarifying that. I didn't pick that up. No, the half-year requirement would not be required, because that would say the child would have to live more than 6 months.
Because why isn't it required?
I'm not sure. As long as they have a heartbeat, because that was researched on Tuesday.
Okay.
And that does make sense. Now, when Bill was growing up, when dinosaurs ruled the earth, when did you get a Social Security number? One person who's in the class on Tuesday is almost as old as me knew this. When did Bill get his first Social Security card? When I first got a job. That's right. Then they made it so, I think in 1986, all dependent kids who were 5 years old or older had to have Social Security numbers. It was interesting to note that between 1986 and 1987, the number of dependent children claimed on tax returns dropped by like 40%. Because let's face it, people were taking their dog Rex or something and putting him down as a dependent, but when you had to have a Social Security number, you couldn't do that anymore. And now I understand from talking to ladies today, your child is born and you immediately go and get a Social Security number.
We need 2 weeks.
All right, well, they give you 2 weeks to recover, okay. Well, there's something to say for it, I mean, I guess. Now, one thing that I'm not covering on the exams, but again, you might want to look at it if you have this situation, is what goes into support. This could be an issue that some of you might have, or maybe you have a client, because some people I know do taxes here. For example, if you have a family, I always give the example, we have a mother and father, we have a 90-pound grandmother, and they have a son who's a football player like Refrigerator Perry. There's 4 people in the household, and the food bill would be deemed to be allocated equally to each of the 4 members of the household, although Granny probably ate, 1/8 of what Refrigerator Perry ate. So you can't get into issues like that and what's included in support. What about the fair value of the area of the residence that's occupied? I'm not testing that, but you might run into that. The other situation you might run into in real life is when you talk about divorce. Normally, there's certain rules that exist, but normally it's the custodial parent who gets the dependency exemption. But a divorce agreement could specifically give the dependency exemption to, let's say, the not living on the premises father, in which case mom is not getting a dependency exemption, but she could claim head of household filing status, and dad is getting the dependency exemption for the child. Now watch out here. Let's say we have a divorced couple and one of them is supposed to claim the dependency exemption, but both claim it. Whoever files first is going to get the exemption. And the IRS software picks that up. They don't pick up a lot of stuff, but they always pick that up if two people who are filing different returns claim the same person. So that should be worked out in the divorce agreement. Also, there's a form you can file that relinquishes the exemption. And so you could actually have a head of household filing status without having a dependent child. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. I'm not asking that on that particular thing on the exam, but watch out. Now, let's go to itemizing versus the standard deduction. Many people, when they own property under existing rules, will itemize. I am still itemizing, although I own my house outright. But if they eliminate my real estate tax deduction, etc., then I will be doing the standard deduction for the first time in many, many years. Now, on page 3-4, they give the basic standard deduction for 2014. Help me out a little bit here, even if you don't have that in front of you. Single person, $6,200. Married filing joint, $12,400. What's the relationship between $6,200 and $12,400? It's double. That was part of George W. They made it so the standard deduction for married filing joint is twice that of single. Notice the head of household is kind of in between, $9,100. We'll talk more about head of household in a few minutes. Now, we've had some people in both classes address something about the P's limitations, but before I go to that, I want to show one place where there is some discrimination against married. On page 3-5, let me give a little history again. To the end of 1986, if you were elderly, when are you deemed to be elderly? 65, and when are you deemed to be 65? The day before. There's got to be a story here. The day before your birthday. There must have been somebody many years ago whose birthday was January 1st and they wanted to get the benefit the year earlier. You know, a Donald Trump type person who was much younger. But to the end of 1986, if you or your spouse, not dependents, you or your spouse was either 65 or visually impaired, and they still use the term blind, you got an extra personal exemption for those statuses. That changed in the 86 Act. And now it says if you are elderly, or if you are blind, which could occur at any age, you get an extra standard deduction. So if you're elderly or blind and you itemize, you get nada. Now look at the amounts though. A single person who is elderly, so that will happen to me if I lose the real estate tax deduction and state income tax, I would get an additional $1,550 if this were 2014. So I'd get $6,200 plus $1,550. If I were also blind, I'd get another $1,550. So it'd be $6,200 plus $1,550 plus $1,550. If I were married filing joint, and both of us are elderly, we would get the $12,400 for married filing joint, and we would get not $1,550 but $1,200 for us both being elderly. So it'd be $12,400 plus $1,200 plus $1,200. What if we're both elderly and visually impaired? $12,400 plus $1,200 plus $1,200 plus $1,200 plus $1,200. Notice the head of household of $1,550 is similar to the single. So the rule for Illinois is different, but this is the federal rule. Everyone see that? There's going to be a lot here. The chapter you need to spend a little bit of time chewing on this weekend is this one. The other 1 and 2 and 13, not as much unless you have the time. Now, let's skip ahead. Oh, first of all, let's make a stop. On page 3-12, this is the piece limitation. I am not testing this, and this should be in your software, but some of you have researched this area. The piece limitations, there's one on exemptions and there's one on itemized deductions. These were put into the tax law in 1990, the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. Who was the president, if you can think back that far, in 1990? Who is it?
Clinton?
No, that was 92. Who was
George
before
Bush.
Clinton?
George Bush.
George H. That's right, the dad, H.W. A decent one. I'm sorry. H.W. That's right, that's right. And of course, he was the one who didn't get reelected because he said no new taxes, and then he passed new taxes. But this was put into the law on a temporary basis and was due to expire at the end of 1995, but it stayed in the law through 2010. Then it was gone, but in the fiscal cliff legislation, the American Taxpayers Relief Act, they reinstated it. And it's directed more toward upper middle income people. Middle income, lower income aren't affected, and the wealthy, well, so what? And basically, you can lose 100% of your personal independency exemptions. And they give a nice explanation. I used to send a typed one out, but it's on 3-12 and 3-13. It's the section 3227. You can follow along. I'm not testing that. And if that affects your own personal situation, that probably would come up in the software. But if you and your spouse make a significant amount of money, you could end up losing a portion of your, up to 100% of your personal independency exemptions. There's a similar provision, again, it's the PEASE limitations that relate to itemized deductions. Same background, same exact background. It was temporary, and then of course it got extended. And that was in here, oh there it is, it's on page 3-4, and they show you an example there as well. Only you can lose up to 80% of your itemized deductions. If again you're upper middle income, and you can check, I'm not testing it, but check that phase out and see if it's included in any software for any clients you might have. The reason I don't like it, although it doesn't affect me personally, is that it's directed toward upper middle income. I mean, I'm sure that Warren Buffett and Bill Gates probably lose all their personal independency exemptions. And they're decent people. I mean, they're in favor of the estate tax and progressive tax rate system, but their income is over $1 billion a year. Let's say you and your spouse had $700,000 worth of income. Well, that's pretty good, but you're not extremely wealthy. You also would lose 100% of your personal dependency exemptions. So just take a look at that for your own knowledge there. These were reinstated. I always like these temporary taxes that are reinstated. Remember a few years ago, around 2006 or so, you were able to get a rebate of excise taxes on long-distance landlines? I don't know if you can remember back that far. That was a temporary tax that was put into the law in the 1890s to support the Spanish-American War. Of course, at that time, having a telephone was a luxury. And we still had it until 2006. Interesting how that works. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out here deals with the kiddie tax. Let's go to page 3-16 and 3-17.
What section are you?
The 3365. Yes, 3365. By the way, that 3365, you know what that relates to? That's the section in the CCH Standard Federal Tax Reporter Series. By the way, the Journal of Accountancy had an article on this area in July of 2007. I love this picture. Oh my God, dread the kitty tax. Oh my God. It's not that bad. Did you find it? Paragraph 3365, example 3.17.
Oh, yeah. I got time there?
Yeah, it says tax returns of dependents. And then on 3-17 it says kitty tax. They don't show page numbers. I looked at that because yesterday I didn't have the book with me, but I wanted to look something up. And I said, where the hell are the page numbers? I did notice that absence. Yes, so I can see the dismay you might have. I guess you'll have to do scrolling, because that's what I had to do to find what I needed. Prior to the 86 Act, a lot of people had passive income or portfolio income. We have two differentiations now in their kids' names because their kids were in lower tax brackets. So the kitty tax was created, originally related to age, it went through age 14, now it's been extended. And it basically said if you're claimed as a dependent on someone else's return, and you have unearned income, you're going to be subject to the kitty tax. Now, we just spent a few minutes here. First of all, it says the standard deduction for an individual who can be claimed as a dependent on the tax return of another is the greater of, this is people like kids who are claimed as dependents. Their standard deduction is the greater of their earned income plus $350 up to the maximum allowable standard deduction. I'll give an example of that, or $1,000. So everybody, even if they're claimed out as a dependent on someone else's return, everyone, even if they're claimed as a dependent on someone else's return, and if they have zero earned income, gets a standard deduction of $1,000. So the kitty tax has 3 tiers. And that article would say it's T-E-A-R-S. I'm hoping it's T-I-E-R-S. Now this is only passive income. This is dividends, interest, rent income, trust income. It's income you don't earn. The first $1,000 of unearned income for these kitties, and notice kitties, now look at the definition of kitties. 17 years old or younger. Now, I must confess, this part 2 and 3, we'll go to the second and third tier in a second. I haven't read much about these, but these really disturb me. 18 years old, subject to the kitty tax unless the child has earned income exceeding half of their support. 19 to 23-year-old full-time student, subject to the kitty tax unless the child has earned income exceeding half of their support. Well, let's say your child is a sophomore at U of I, 22 years old. If they don't have earned income exceeding half of their support, they're going to be subject to the kitty tax till they're 23. You know, I would think that would have major ramifications, but I actually haven't read much about that.
So does this mean if they have unearned income under $1,000, it doesn't have to be claimed at all on their?
That's right. That is correct. That's right. It has to be over the $1,000. So maybe I haven't heard much about this going to age 23 because these young people don't have unearned income. They haven't been the recipient of grandma's gift of stock or something or whatever. Now, the first $1,000 tax exempt because of the standard deduction that everyone gets. Now this is only unearned income. The second $1,000 would be taxed at the child's own incremental tax bracket. Second $1,000. What's the child's own incremental tax bracket probably? 10%, 15% maybe?
But it's still on the parent's return.
Well, it can be. You could file separately or you could put it on the parent's return. The third tier, amounts of unearned income in excess of $2,000 are taxed at
Parents?
parent's highest incremental bracket, and that's probably on their own return. Parent's highest incremental bracket, which could be as high as 39.6.
Is this on that, on a separate form? Is it just lumped in with,
I used to be a separate form in the 8,000 series.
isn't it like parents elect, well, what is it called?
Yes, there's an election, and there is an
Election to
IRS form.
report.
There is an IRS form for that. Now, let me comment something I don't know. As you are aware, for wealthier people, I think income like over, 300,000.